thank you all for joining. Excited to be back for another SASIC webinar. So today, Phil and I will talk about ransomware, right? So what it is, where we're heading as in the industry, and what you can essentially do about it. Next. So first of all, I think it's important to understand, when you talk about ransomware, in the last couple of probably maybe 1 or 2 years, in the last couple of months, and then particularly in the last couple of weeks, there's a lot of attention on ransomware campaigns, activities, on specific ransomware groups. But I wanted to make sure, we understand that, first of all, ransomware itself is nothing new. Right? Ransomware has existed for a long time. The reason why we see a larger trend now is how impactful some of these attacks have become. Right. So if you look into today alone in the US, in the last year, there was an increase of around 62% of attacks that were specifically ransomware campaigns. Even more concerning, if you look worldwide, almost every minute there's at least 5 ransomware attacks that are happening. And furthermore, while before, when it started, ransomware groups were looking into very small fees, essentially, that they were trying to get from mainly consumers. Now the ransom amounts are continue to increase, right? And alarming also the fact that the payouts are happening much more frequently, right? With the average payouts ranging at around $500,000 worldwide, right? So it's no longer just these 20, 30, or 100 or 1,000 bucks that ransomware groups are asking consumers in order to decrypt what they previously encrypted. It is now large-scale attacks that are very lucrative for the threat actors. And with that, that's the reason why ransomware has become a top priority for many security practitioners. Next. So when you look into the evolution of ransomware attacks, right? So as I mentioned at the beginning, ransomware attacks itself is nothing new. Has been there for quite some time. However, the tactics are evolving in terms of what the threat actors are actually doing. One aspect is when it comes to cloud storages, it used to be that threat actors would just directly, once you have established access to an endpoint, just encrypt the files, right? And then the idea was we're going to hold the ransom, user will pay the ransom, and maybe we will give access so that the user will get back access to their files. Today, with double extortion methods, it works a little differently. So the way they're doing it nowadays is they actually do the data exfiltration, right? So they get all the files in an enterprise that are typically critical to an organization. Think of financial records, HR records, engineering blueprints, and so on. And then they will also do the encryption, encryption part. And the idea is very simple. Either they're going to make money by the organization paying the ransom, or they're going to make money by selling the data that they have stolen to the highest bidder, right? So it's essentially almost like a safety switch for the threat actors that they're using. Or in some cases, they will just do both, right? So the organization will pay the ransom, and the ransomware group will just still sell the data, right? Because obviously, on the defender side, we cannot assume that the person that done an illegal activity to get in to compromise the environment to now all of a sudden play by the rules and not do anything with what they have stolen, essentially. That's one big evolution. The other one is what we call ransomware as a service. The entry point for executing a ransomware attack has become incredibly cheap, right? And in some cases, there are even payment methods for the groups available, right? So rather than you spending time and understanding how to do a ransomware attack, attackers or threat actors or anyone interested can go in the dark web and essentially hire the talents. And it's not even, in some cases, it's not even like upfront payments required. It's just a percentage of what comes out of the ransomware attack. In addition to that, what we're also seeing is a much more targeted ransomware attacks. So while before ransomware attacks will disrupt the entire enterprise environment, we do see now occasions where ransomware attacks are targeted to specific individual, to specific assets inside an environment. And also what we're seeing is it's no longer just on Windows or Windows endpoints. Ransomware attacks are happening cross-platform. Right, dark radiation was one recent example where they were abusing bash commands in Linux to hold ransom in a Docker container environment. With cryptocurrency, of course, still in the rise, right? It's an easy method for the threat actors to get paid out with pretty much a good amount of way to hide from the authorities. And we will only continue seeing ransomware attacks increase. And the reason for that is, of course, cryptocurrency, right? Make it easy to get paid, but also the adoption of cloud infrastructure, right? So like in the security world, it's always a race, right? Between the threat actor and the defense, because just like we are looking into adopting things like cloud service solutions, so SaaS-based applications, infrastructure as a service, so are threat actors, right? There are some interesting papers on the adoption of AI from an offensive standpoint, for example, right? These things are no longer like future music. These things are happening today. So today, threat actors are using cloud infrastructure when they are doing their ransomware attacks, right? With that, they obviously have a potentially infinite scale in terms of how they can prepare their attacks and execute their attacks. Next. So when you think about like the true cost of a ransomware attack, a lot of people think about just the cost of the ransom, right? So if we were to pay this amount, that's it, we are back in business. But really what is important to understand, and there are different numbers floating around in the industry, like from the IBM data breach report, the Poneman research, right? But overall, what's important here to understand, like the true cost of a ransomware attack doesn't end by understanding the ransom amount that an organization could potentially pay. It goes beyond that because you need to factor in the business disruption, the brand damage that an organization will face once it becomes public, right? The actual incident itself, like what does it cost to manage the security incident associated with a ransomware attack, right? So when you factor all of these together, what we're seeing in the industry that on average a ransomware attack, right, excluding the actual ransom payment, will cost an organization a typical enterprise environment around $4.6 million, right? So 4.6 million for a ransomware incident, which does not include the actual ransom that an organization might be considering paying out. Next.
Cool. So when you take all of that into account, it's worth getting an update as well on how those pieces of ransomware and the approaches are changing. I think one thing I would add on to their total costs as well was that you've likely become a victim of ransomware because of a lack of one or more security controls, or because some of those security controls are not operating effectively. And so there's also a cost for setting out a control plane or some additional security controls that probably ought to have been there in the first place. And the cost of implementing those after the incident may not be captured in those post-incident response metrics and costs that were summarized too. So bear that in mind. So as Milad was saying, the profitability of ransomware, the enterprise of ransomware, if you like, has improved significantly. You can see that even based on the number of news articles that you see on LinkedIn, that this is growing in volume exponentially, and lots of external sort of geopolitical or other external factors have kind of facilitated this acceleration, not least of which things like the pandemic. So organized crime actors have picked up that there's a way of making money during COVID where perhaps some of their other standard enterprises haven't been so successful. So the movement of drugs or people in order to acquire funding sources is difficult when nobody can move around the planet. So having an opportunity to cash out in other ways that require only an internet connection is clearly attractive. And I think when therefore we look at ransomware, we have to think that this is not just cybercrime, but it is just crime. And the way that people have approached it has potentially been associated to the IT and technology side, but actually the motivations are not purely from a cybersecurity or technology angle. That there is real crime behind pulling the strings for some of the threat actors. We also see that nation states have seen that there's an opportunity to generate some chaos and confusion and have that attributed to other actors. So you see the combination of distributed denial of service attacks as well as ransomware attacks, and linking that to existing botnet groups, for example. So my son and I were listening to Darknet Diaries this weekend, where it was discussing how Zeus, the Zeus botnet and Zeus backends had been combined with ransomware. So an interesting listen if you get a moment. Organizations have rushed to the cloud, and the make, do, and mend approach for building out cloud environments has resulted in a generally wider set of vectors for attack, and many of those are permanently internet connected. And as Milad had said, because ransomware is now available as a service, which comes with all the support and benefits that any other software as a service might offer, this commoditization and volume-based approach for ransomware is reminiscent of a gold rush, where actually everybody who is that way inclined is looking to see if they can make some cash out of it. We see that the adoption of cryptocurrencies has resulted in a slightly easier way of money laundering, as long as you can push it through a vast number of alternate landing points and money mules on the way. And I guess what we see here is that the mechanisms for generating that cash have resulted in an enterprise view, which is to reinvest some of the proceeds into evolving and building out the capabilities of the ransomware that gets generated, which means that it's becoming more effective at what it does, more surgical in terms of the things that it's going after, and increasingly it's tipping the odds, unfortunately not in your favor, about your ability to either detect, respond, or recover from such an attack. So what we see is that the attackers are having multiple goes at cashing out in the same mechanism. So the hybrid or double attack, where you can both steal the information, threaten to release it as well, is important. But also, what we're also seeing is that some high percentage of victims are being hit for repeat payments. So actually, you may pay, you may get your data back, but you may also find that that's not the only request for a ransom. And that actually there may be some drip feeding of additional information that you also don't want to get published, that may then generate a new request for some money, for some cash. So how is that changing? Well, in terms of its delivery mechanism, phishing is still the most popular start point. Increasingly, there are indications that other mediums that are commonly used, such as instant messaging and chat, or comment spam, comment phishing, is being used across websites, social media, and watering holes. All of which, if you browse these from a corporate endpoint and click on the link, will give the attacker the same kind of head start as if you opened a poorly email, for example. I guess whilst some of these attacks are highly personalized, a good deal of them are fully automated at the beginning part. So don't always take it personally. From at least some perspectives, it may be a botnet that is reaching out to see if there are any initial indicators of potential compromise, and therefore, it is something that we all have to be aware of, because it may not be something that our organization is on the radar of a given ransomware group. We might just come onto their radar because we've shown a side to ourselves that looks open to opportunity. What we're seeing is, though, that attackers are getting smarter about who they then choose to formulate that attack after that validation that you're open to it has been reached. So people are spending more time looking at how they could make sure that they guarantee success later on in the kill chain. Certainly, if you put in your job title on LinkedIn that you're a SQL DBA for a large organization, you can expect to be the target of a significant number of phishing attempts. As Milad had said before, the cloud portals and management consoles are still really easy targets. And actually, if they're looking to gain a foothold and they're able to use existing caches of stolen credentials, the cloud's a good place to go hunting for things like that. And typically, organizations won't have implemented protections against password spraying, for example, which may prevent people from which may prevent attackers from being able to get easy access into other information that would help them later in an attack. So, if I can get in to your cloud organization and find out about people's emails, calendars, shared files, and organization structures, this is going to help me a lot in terms of my reconnaissance phase. And actually, a lot of that information won't necessarily be easily detectable with standard logging enabled on your cloud enterprises. Bear in mind that if your organization is a supplier to other customers, that actually you may not be the target, but your downstream customers may be, and that actually those connections that you need to maintain in order to offer the services that you do may become part of the vectors of attack that need to be considered. If you're a charity, you need to think about how the messages that your charity and the ideas and the ideals that you stand for may be used as a reason why you would come up for attention from particular attacker groups. And for healthcare organizations right now, the motive may be around just pure disruption of your business as usual operations, keeping you busy responding to attacks so that you can't provide the services that you provide. We're definitely seeing an uptick in activity just in the last few weeks, where critical national infrastructure and that sort of organization is becoming generally a target for disruption. So I guess what I'm saying here is we may not have hit peak ransomware. If you take these geopolitical situations out of the mix, the trend is still significantly upward. So once an organization has been penetrated and has an active piece of ransomware going on, what are the consequences? Well, I guess we run incident response for a number of organizations. And we have seen, determined efforts to inhibit recovery. So we've seen threat actors going after not just file stores and stores of information on databases and shared document storage, but actually we've seen organizations having their virtual machine infrastructure tickled to see whether it can be removed during an attack to make it difficult for you to move or recover whole machines in your environment. We've also seen that organizations are targeted against their backups to make it difficult for them to recover and make use of backups that may have been good and used to bring yourself back to a working state. So that technique number on MITRE is often underplayed or forgotten, but it's really critical to know that your virtual machine stores and your backup stores are protected and only accessible by a very least privileged organized group of people and services. We also see that there is a determined effort to find out how much you can afford. So this is smart now in terms of attackers who are chasing after your assets. They want to know what sort of ransom is going to be acceptable and what sort of ransom they might be prepared to accept as a negotiated position. So what we're also seeing is that there's a fairly determined effort to go after items like the general ledger or other significant results or pre-results announcement material that would give an idea of what cash there is in the bank for an organization. So bear that in mind, that there may be some commonality between what you get asked for and how much exact cash you've got in the bank. And I guess these things are helping to adjust the balance of power in a conversation about paying ransom. We've seen so many organizations have ended up paying that it's almost an expected part of the conversation to negotiate it, which is difficult, and it plays into the insurance and the mechanisms by which you might get the insurance coverage for your organization. What we've seen is that cyber insurance is not as easy as it used to be in order to get yourself covered. If previously you had relied on the fact that ransomware was covered and that the ransom itself was going to be covered within your insurance, expect to see that changing. Recent events and recent renewals and discussions that I've had with organizations have suggested that the policy wording and I'm guessing from behind the scenes, the reinsurance capability is, for those companies has meant that you might be more expected to find the money for any ransom yourself. And the knock-on effect of that is actually twofold. Is that in order, if it is still covered in your policy, you would be expected to be able to prove that you've got a reasonable level of security before you'd expect to be able to draw down on that benefit. But actually, if that benefit's not available to you, if you can't have the ransom payment itself covered, that actually it's more up to you to make sure that you don't get hit in the first place than perhaps it would have been before. So in some cases, you just need to reflect that risk and the perception of that risk is changing too, and therefore it leads you to ask the question, well, what can you do in this adapting landscape? So bearing that in mind, how should organizations change? So I guess how I would view this is that you would split it into three significant portions. The first one is around planning. So picking up on the last point about insurance, go and have a look at what your cyber insurance wording states, and therefore what the stance is that it's giving you, and check that you know what you're buying, and where it stops and your responsibility starts. As popular as this is in the news at the moment, you kind of have to take your own responsibility level about making sure that you've got coverage, because your board isn't going to want to hear that you assumed that it was covered in your cyber insurance, and then when it's hit the fan finally, you don't have anything to throw at it. Certainly don't have necessarily the cash to throw at it. It could be the determination about your survivability, against your organization's goals. Work out what your minimum viable operation is for your business, for your organization, and what would you fall back to if you had to keep things running, and look at strengthening the protection mechanisms around those things that would be considered part of that minimum viable operation. Do some research and perhaps have an idea of who might be interested in you from a threat perspective. It may be that you're just in the middle of the pack. It may be that there isn't any reason why you wouldn't just be another piece of collateral damage in a botnet piece of examination. But it may be that there are things that you can consider would suggest the different types of ransomware threat actors that you may be faced with, and therefore the complexity or sophistication of the attacks may play a part in terms of what controls and the weight of the controls investment that you put in place would be. And you need to think about how long you can last during a sustained attack. So, if this is measured in days, then your ability to respond needs to be at the top of the game. This would come down to hours in terms of a response. You would need to be able to see it happen and be able to pull some levers very rapidly in order to protect your business and keep it going. If it was measured in weeks, then at least you need to have practiced your recovery and work out what you would do and have a plan. And if it's measured in years, then maybe ransomware isn't a massive concern for you, although the embarrassment, and the ability for the threat actor to expose information that you maybe don't want to get in the public eye might be more relevant in that case. The second section is around control. So what I would say is, using the picture on the right here, MITRE have released a specific version of the attack map that is highlighting specifically the technique numbers and the techniques that are used typically in a ransomware attack. And so use this against the list of controls that you might already believe you've got in place, and use it to treat and tweak and increase the capability, particularly early in the kill chain, but also with a significant strengthened position on lateral movement and credential acquisition. If you can do that and make sure that that you've got a strong set of controls that map to the techniques that are typically used, you're going to be in a better place to both detect and prevent and respond to ransomware style incidents. So what does that mean in more detail? It's about changing default passwords. It's about using a quality EDR and endpoint protection solution. It's about using multi-factor authentication, and specifically on privileged accounts. You want to take your users to the phishing gym, and get them exercised and ready for responding to the most modern versions of phishing attack styles, and build out your security awareness. You want to prevent email attachments and specific file types that are typically used by the threat actors from being received in the first place, and detonate nasty URLs in emails before they're delivered to your users. Make sure that your users have got only the privilege that they need, and that they can't reach through your forward proxy specific file types that again are known, known destinations for malware, but also known file types that are used to initiate command and control traffic. Spend some time looking at an immutable backup solution, and think about how you would make sure that your backups couldn't be tampered with. And think again, many organizations have a more or less flat network once you get inside the corporate boundary. How could you break that up? Maybe not maybe not right now because network segmentation is sometimes difficult, but how would you do it in an emergency? What could you put in place that would take the edge off a significant attack and buy you some time? These are the things that will help you make a dent in that kill chain from left to right, where left is the initial access proposition and the right hand side is that impact, your exfiltration of data, your obfuscation of the data, and the inhibition of recovery. And then what you want to be doing next is looking at how you improve it. So don't just assume that everything's going to work properly. Put in place some ongoing red team tests, and these don't have to be expensive external red teamers. For example, you can perform a large number of these tests as individual solutions that would prove that you've got a control in place, but also allow you to rehearse a response behind the scenes, and just get that one piece working. The ability to continuously improve is really important. And when you're looking at your organization's approach to this, you could copy something like the Netflix approach, which is, we want to try and get 1% better every day, and recognizing that you can't fix everything, but you can make it a little bit better, each day, and therefore at the end of the year you'll be significantly further forward than you were when you first started. So little and often is sometimes a way of getting some progress without having to have such significant investment and waiting for that to land and be proven before you get started. So have a plan about how you respond to an incident and talk through it, and then test it and see where does it go wrong in the dry run. Where is it not working, and what are the questions you would need to answer, which would be, how are we going to determine that multiple servers are all experiencing the same performance problem? How is that turning out to be from an IT issue? How could that possibly be concerned or considered as a security incident? What would be the things that would turn that over for you, that would get you thinking about that? Because often an outsourced IT provider won't necessarily draw the dots, and so you need mechanisms of being able to converse with them that will help you turn that into what might therefore be a security incident that was symptomatic of several small IT challenges. If you do have a plan and you don't follow it, it's going to be really hard to explain to investors and shareholders and trustees. So the plan needs to stand up, and it needs to not be something that you just say, I've got one, but actually I didn't open it because it was more like a boilerplate. So it has to be a usable plan. And actually, if you've got nothing else, start with a phone tree, start with a mechanism that allows you to form a team, that allows you to communicate with each other out of band, so that if your main IT is compromised, you've still got a mechanism of running that incident without giving away or showing your hand about how you're responding to it. Recognize that the threat landscape is going to continue to change, so that proof that you're exercising also needs to change. And it may be that you need to listen harder in some areas, or put additional security controls in new areas of IT investment, and bear in mind that may affect your minimum viable operation. We need to see how long it might take you to recover, and what you would do in that recovery. But at the end of that, what I would recommend is that you run some level of breach attack simulation that starts at the beginning of the kill chain and works its way all the way through, because often it's the joining up of individual controls that is often missed. So you might therefore have a set of controls that all nominally appear to work really well together, but they don't work together. so individual controls work really well, but they don't hand off and support each other, where they, from an architectural approach, have good overlaps. And that's something that you'll only really see if you emulate a proper threat actor in your environment, end to end. So, there are resources in MITRE. Healthcyber.mitre.org is a good place to look. They have this attack navigator view, but also some ideas and some suggestions on how you might move forward. That I think summarizes how organizations should change to adapt. And for that, I'll hand back to Milad for a summary.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Phil. So I think throughout the webinar, a lot of insights have been shared, like in terms of ransomware, where we started, why we see a continuous increase in ransomware attacks, the different frameworks that are out there. And before we wrap it up, I wanted to make sure, to share essentially if you do nothing, the 4 things you should be doing from a technology and architecture perspective, right? The first one starts with MFA, multi-factor authentication. I'd say it's nothing unique, to be fair, to ransomware attacks, particularly on multi-factor authentication, right? A lot of security practitioners have been advocating for MFA for quite some time for various use cases. However, still we are in the industry not to a stage where we'd say generally everybody has MFA in place for all users. But this is definitely an area organizations need to deal with, right? So at minimum, multi-factor authentication for all users, right, that are facing the internet. There shouldn't be any exceptions, not for your board members, not for anyone else, right? Everybody needs to essentially pull together and have the same configuration in that matter. The second point, I think it's a little bit broader, right? Historically, the way we looked into security were parameter-based security models, primarily looking into on the network side, right? So things like DMZs come to mind, IDS, and so on, firewall systems, etc. But reality with today's threat landscape, and even if you look into how ransomware attacks are executed, many of these legacy security models are at best might slow down the attack, but it won't help you in terms of preventing or recovering from these ransomware attacks as quickly as possible. So a key aspect here is looking into zero trust, because again, it gives you the benefit of the principle of least privilege, right? Users, endpoints no longer have access by default to everything. So that's a definite an area to look into. The third one, I think this is one thing that I see consistent across any recommendation. Doesn't matter if it's like coming from the private sector. I think one of the unique things that every vendor also in this space agrees on, as well as any government recommendation, it's backup, backup, backup. Right, so you need to be able to back up regularly, and you need to be able know if these backups are successful, and you need to be able to know how you can actually restore from these backups and how you protect these backups, right? So I've seen a lot of times organizations saying, yeah, we do backups. And then you would ask, like, how do you do the backups? And they would maybe not know the answer, or they would say, well, we do these Windows backups. Right, but which is not the point here, right? You need to understand like the failover plans, fallback plans, how you protect the backups, and so on. So that's a big area. And then the fourth piece is, because the ransomware attacks are happening much faster these days, and generally attacks are happening like extremely fast, it's no longer just like where you can wait for a human analyst to sometimes take action on, right? So if you think about an average enterprise and the SOC team, they are already overwhelmed. They already have more alerts that they could possibly handle in a day, right? So I've seen like numbers and case studies where SOC teams will confirm that they cannot handle all the alerts that are getting raised on the same day, right? So that means like if you have systems in place that require human intervention, it's basically giving the threat actors at least 24, 48, or 72 hours of free access to the environment where they can just do whatever they want in terms of making their attack, their ransomware attack, successful, right? So you need to look into systems that can drastically reduce the mean time to detect as well as the mean time to respond, particularly for ransomware attacks, right? Because some alerts might be okay to wait like a day or two, right? Maybe it's like a initial recon activities. But the second there's like data exfiltration or encryption activity, these are split-second decisions that needs to be taken as like ASAP in the environment. So you need to look into a system that can support that essentially. Right. So like all in all, like these are like the four big areas that I always recommend for organization to look for when they are looking into building out their use cases for ransomware, understanding areas they need to strengthen their muscles in.
Awesome.
Thank you very much. That was very, very, very informative session with a lot of nuggets in there. Phil, Milad, thank you very much for that indeed. I'm just going to wait to see if any questions come through, because I can imagine the people on the session today may or may not want to take up the opportunity to ask you a question. One thing I'm going to ask, and I thought the summary at the end was fantastic, because it's always nice to have a couple of takeaways for us to act on. But my question, I suppose, was to Phil, because what I thought was interesting, there was some practical things that you mentioned in your session, and while the 4 summary takeaways we had there were great to get on with, I just sensed there were 2 or 3 practical things you find when talking with organizations that people can put into place straight away that have a big impact and maybe are overlooked with the grand plans that people come up with. Were there any? What would you suggest?
So I think from my perspective, it's about getting specific for me. So I would, in a cost constrained environment, you might look at things like Sysmon, or some of the configs that are associated to that, to lift out very specific technique numbers and make sure that if you do have a SOC that's often overwhelmed, that you put some level of gravity on the techniques that are in particular used at the beginning of the kill chain to give you a chance. If you get lucky enough to see something at the very beginning, you've got the best chance of preventing it getting further to the right of the kill chain. What I would say is that in my experience, by the time the SOC has gotten hold of it, it's typically around the middle of the kill chain, where there's lots of other noise and credentials being used, and therefore my focus, or my suggested focus, would be very much on that the just-in-time access of privileged accounts and removal of privilege is super important, and making sure that discovery phase that the attacker has to go through is as difficult as possible. So put some frustration in around making sure that you don't have weak protocols that allow them to take advantage of discovery and also credential recovery capabilities, and also make it difficult for them to find those stores of information. If you haven't done so already, think about how an attacker has to go through the process of compromising multiple assets. And actually, if you don't need your peers, essentially your endpoints, to be able to talk to each other, put some deliberate effort into making sure that they can't. The only people that should need to talk from one endpoint to another directly are probably your IT components, your IT service desk, and what have you. So turn it off for the vast majority of people, so that peer-to-peer movement again is more difficult, and therefore it's difficult for the attacker to establish some persistence. Those would be the sorts of things I would suggest, and then I would make sure that you have two-factor as best you can across those critical assets, those things that would be that you would be relying on in order to effect a recovery.